Nicaragua targets foreign diplomats and the Catholic Church for meddling in its internal affairs. Is Daniel Ortega's government revolutionary or clamping down on dissent? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is Nicaragua. Last week, the Netherlands found out what happens when Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega feels insulted. The Dutch announced it would not fund a hospital in the country after having concerns for democracy and human rights. Ortega's government quickly cut diplomatic ties with them and did so by giving the rest of the world an ultimatum.
Whoever comes here to disrespect our people, our homeland, should never come to the Nicaragua again. And we don't want relations with this interventionist government.
Over the past weeks and months, Ortega has developed a fraught relationship with a number of his allies. Washington's new ambassador was banned. The European Union's representative left after being declared persona non grata. And earlier this year, Nicaragua bolted from the Organization of American States, a move Venezuela hailed as courageous. Meanwhile, the Roman Catholic Church, which has tended to play both peacemaker and outspoken government critic, has been the target of raids, expulsions, and arrests. At issue is Ortega's efforts to hold onto power. Those who are now on the outs with him called his re-election last November a sham. It came after 5 of his major political opponents were either arrested or fled the country in the lead-up to the vote. Prior to that, protests in 2018 were met with police violence. 355 people were killed, hundreds arrested, and thousands went into exile. And for the Church's part, attempts to be the lone voice of dissent in this devoutly Catholic country have proven unsuccessful. Take, for instance, Bishop Ronaldo Alvarez. He went on hunger strike to protest against police surveillance of him and his family. And just listen to how he describes what he says is the real issue at hand.
In Nicaragua, everyone is living in a situation of terror. You can move through the streets of Nicaragua and see how the patrols come and go. We are living in a situation of terror, in such a way that here, not only religious or priests, but also many Nicaraguans, I would say the immense majority of Nicaraguans, live in a permanent harassment, and of course, it focuses and intensifies the persecution of some specific people.
Bishop Alvarez's hunger strike did not call off the police. Instead, he and his colleagues were arrested last August. Police conducted a pre-dawn raid on his church's rectory. He was detained along with 8 of his fellow priests, and it resulted in Alvarez being put under house arrest for organizing violent groups. To be sure, his fate is not unusual. A month before Alvarez's arrest, the government targeted a group of 18 Catholic nuns who held foreign passports. They had run a charity for the poor and a children's nursery, and the government said they had not properly declared their funding, an accusation that has been used to shut down 200 organizations in Nicaragua since 2018. In the case of the nuns, the police picked up the group and dropped them off at the border with Costa Rica. For Ortega, this is not just being done in the name of sovereignty, but against what he calls the tyranny of unelected officials who are hostile to his country's best interests.
Who elects the priests? Who elects the bishops? Who elects the Pope? The cardinals? How many votes? Who give them to them? If they are going to be democratic, they should start electing the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops with the vote of the people.
Now, whether Ortega's rationale makes sense, the question is, can the country he runs, one of the poorest in Central America, continue to be further isolated? Just imagine if Tropical Storm Julia, which made landfall just the other day, had hit Nicaragua with the force of a hurricane. Who would Daniel Ortega turn to for help? Well, to unpack all of this, let's bring in our panel. From Nicaragua's capital, Managua, I'm joined by Ben Norton, the founder and editor of the independent news outlet Multipolarista. From Washington is Manuel Orozco, the director of the Inter-American Dialogue's Migration, Remittances and Development Program. And in Brussels, we welcome back Pieter Cleppe, the editor-in-chief of the Brussels Report. Thanks all for being with us here on The Newsmakers. Ben, let me begin with you. What is Daniel Ortega seeking to achieve with his latest actions?
Well, the reality is that these are not really actions that the Nicaraguan government took. This is a response to aggressive actions taken in general by the European Union and the United States. We can't understand Nicaraguan politics today without understanding that there was a very violent coup attempt in 2018 that was kind of a trial run for the successful coup in Bolivia in 2019. Of course, Latin America is a region that has been, colonized by Western powers for hundreds of years. That meddling never ended. The US and the European Union have continued funding extremist right-wing opposition groups that have often resorted to violence to try to violently overthrow the Sandinista government. Of course, when the Sandinistas were first in power in the 1980s, we know that the CIA supported the Contras and imposed sanctions, and those policies continue in a very similar way today. In response to the failure of the coup in 2018, in which hundreds of people were killed on both sides, the US and the European Union imposed illegal unilateral sanctions on Nicaragua, and they've continued to impose more and more sanctions without any international support from the United Nations Security Council, which is illegal. And the government has responded by saying that these are unilateral forms of aggression. Foreign countries are meddling in our internal politics. This is a violation of our sovereignty, and we're not going to have diplomatic relations with them anymore.
Okay, Peter, you are in Brussels right now. Tell me, what do you make of what Ben just said?
Well, of course, it's not a secret that the United States has been intervening in many countries, and it's also clear that sanctions have almost always, I'm sure you can think of counter examples, but almost always sanctions have not been successful in terms of changing policies. They tend to hurt the population. So of course that's all a bad idea. But the idea that the only opposition to the current government of Mr. Ortega would be some right-wingers, I don't think that's correct. There's the Nobel Prize winner of literature, a former vice president of Ortega, who has served, who's no longer welcome in the country. According to him, all the opposition has been made dysfunctional. The Ortega regime controls the legislative branch, the judicial branch as well. So there's a big problem in terms of the rule of law, which of course is unrelated to any misguided Western interventions or misguided Western sanctions. And I think that's the main concern of the EU and the United States. Maybe the tools that they're using are not the appropriate tools. You can definitely make an argument in that line, but clearly from a human rights perspective, we have a problem there.
Okay, so Manuel, I will come to you, but Ben, let me get your thoughts on this one. So clearly from a human rights perspective, there is a problem in Nicaragua. For example, according to two experts appointed by the UN and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Nicaragua must comply with its international obligation to respect and guarantee fundamental freedoms. What do you make of that, Ben?
No, first of all, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is an arm of the Organization of American States, and this gets exactly to the problem I was talking about earlier. These institutions are thoroughly dominated by Western powers and have acted as interventionist tools. The Organization of American States openly in public backed a coup that overthrew the elected government in Bolivia in 2019. These institutions have showed how extremely corrupt and illegitimate they are across Latin America. That's why we see even more centrist presidents in the region, like Alberto Fernandez in Argentina, who are openly criticizing the Organization of American States. There is a crisis of institutional legitimacy because of the bias of these organizations. That's why we've seen the emergence of
Okay,
new
Ben, I just want to make sure I get
institutions
this
like
right.
the
So you were
CELAC.
indicating that there is no problem whatsoever when it comes to freedom of speech and fundamental rights in Nicaragua right now?
I'm saying that these issues are extremely exaggerated by Western powers that have a political interest, a vested interest in destabilizing the Sandinista government. It's no secret that the United States and the European Union strongly supported the neoliberal right-wing governments in Nicaragua that governed from 1990 until 2007 as poverty skyrocketed, unemployment skyrocketed, violence and migration skyrocketed. The Sandinista government that came back in 2007 through democratic elections has been the safest, most peaceful government that Nicaragua has seen in decades. The situation in Nicaragua has actually been much better than in neighboring countries like El Salvador and Honduras, where the U.S. backed another coup in 2009, and Honduras had the highest murder rate on earth. Meanwhile, Nicaragua, yeah, there are problems as there are in any country, but Nicaragua is an oasis of stability, and there's much less violence compared to other countries in Central America. We always have to compare apples to apples and not oranges.
I mean, when you say that there are problems, is the president taking effective measures to contain these problems or not?
All we have to do is look at polls. MAR Consultores, which is the main polling firm for Central America, finds that Ortega has around a 70% approval rating. The only other president that's more popular in the region is the new president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, who's also demonized by Western governments and called authoritarian. So the people of these countries are actually quite supportive of their presidents, but then Western powers that have a history of colonizing these countries say that the people are too stupid to understand what their governments are doing and that they're all just brainwashed by these supposed authoritarian leaders. There's a very colonial kind of racist condescension that people use to talk about people in Nicaragua and Central America, which are some of the poorest regions of the world. And the Nicaraguan government has provided healthcare and education and public housing programs in one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. I'm from the United States. The U.S. government doesn't have healthcare. The U.S. government doesn't have free healthcare. But in Nicaragua, people actually do have that. So it's not a surprise why the government is popular here.
Okay, Manuel, I saw you shake your head a few moments ago. Would you like to respond to Ben?
No, I mean, ignorance is a bliss. I think it's an insult to your viewers to listen to pamphletarian politics. I mean, let's just look at the facts. There are 400,000 Nicaraguans that left Nicaragua in the past 2 years. Since 2018, only 3,000 Nicaraguans will migrate for work. Now it's a country of 6.5 million people. People are voting with their feet. There are 200 prisoners, and last week, 34 member states of the Organization of American States unanimously voted to tell the Nicaraguan government to release the political prisoners. You have 54 media outlets that have been censored. The right of movement is censored. The freedom of speech is censored. The books are forbidden to be read in Nicaragua. I mean, Nicaragua is a rogue state. The only ally that it has is Russia and Iran. So, it's basically a country where the right to live is denied by the state.
Okay, Ben, now I know you're going to disagree, but most of the things that Manuel just mentioned have been corroborated by human rights organizations that include the United Nations.
No, I mean, you keep saying the United Nations. You have to point to specific reports from the United Nations. You can't just generally say human rights organizations and then the United Nations. You have to be specific. The reality is that many of these so-called civil society organizations that constantly demonize Nicaragua are funded by Western governments. It's well known the United States has arms of the CIA that have a long history of supporting the Contras going back to the 1980s, like the National Endowment for Democracy, the U.S. Agency for International Development. The European Union has the European Endowment for Democracy. These institutions have funded right-wing so-called civil society organizations that are actually anti-Sandinista activist groups. And this is the same as for media outlets. There are media outlets that actually, during the coup attempt in 2018, were broadcasting open calls for violence, telling people to go out to the streets and to literally hang President Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo in El Carmen. This was in the case of 100% Noticias, which is a U.S. government-funded so-called media outlet. These are open, explicit calls for violence to violently overthrow the government and kill the president. And yeah, that media outlet was shut down because that's not journalism. You can't. The U.S. and the European Union have funded what is essentially terrorism and violence. And they expect that the government just simply allows us. No sovereign government anywhere in the world would tolerate this. Look what happened in the United States on January 6th.
Then let me add one more question.
So far-right extremists stormed the Capitol. That's exactly what Nicaragua has been dealing with for years now.
So as I understand from what you just said, everything that is wrong in Nicaragua right now is due to the West, correct?
No, but it's under attack. We've seen again and again that there are countries like Cuba, which has been under an illegal blockade for 60 years.
Okay, but Cuba is not the topic right now. I also want to focus on the rhetoric that has been adopted by Ortega. For example, he attacked the Vatican, the Chilean president, Gabriel Boric, and Brian Nichols, the White House Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, who Ortega described as a, quote, poor black man with a bulldog face. I mean, that's not the kind of rhetoric we hear from a head of a state, do we?
That's another, politically motivated mistranslation. No, the reality is that why did Nicaragua criticize these foreign leaders who continue to meddle in his internal affairs? Any sovereign leader of any country would criticize a foreign country that is trying to destabilize his government, overthrow his government. All we have to do is look at the recent history of Latin America, where the United States and the European Union have constantly supported coups, military interventions, imposed unilateral sanctions. I mean, we see it so blatantly in the open with the attempt to impose an unelected parallel regime of Juan Guaido in Venezuela, the 2019 coup in Bolivia, the 2009 coup in Honduras, the imprisonment of Lula da Silva in Brazil. The United Nations said that those were illegal. That was a politically motivated case. I mean, across the region, we see this constant attack on any progressive force.
Okay, you have made your point, Ben. Let me move to Peter now. Now, Peter, you have been patiently listening to what we are discussing in this debate. Now, after the ambassador was declared persona non grata, the Dutch Foreign Ministry basically said that, in fact, the EU said that European Union is going to respond in a firm and proportional manner. What kind of response do you think they will come up with?
Oh, well, I don't think it's so easy to say, but what I would expect is at some point they're going to look at what is called Magnitsky sanctions. So these are sanctions not that are specifically designed not to damage and hurt the population, which is of course a bad idea. Look indeed at Cuba or I think Venezuela at some point as well. So the idea of Magnitsky sanctions is that sort of the cronies at the top, that whenever they have assets in the West or when they want to, travel for health reasons to the West, that this is being complicated. I mean, to a large degree, this is symbolic because these peoples are, of course, smart enough to try to circumvent that, to be quick enough. But I think it's important morally that we say, look, I mean, if you oppress your population, as is happening in Nicaragua, I mean, sorry, like we're banning many people from getting a visa. Many well-meaning people that intend no harm. We are certainly gonna ban you if you're sort of close to a regime like that. Also, I would like to respond that I saw that also CNN, the Spanish version of CNN, is now illegal in Nicaragua. I mean, look, you can hardly argue that this is some kind of a right-wing, far-right outlet. CNN is not known as that, right? I mean, it has its shortcomings, sure. But why not let the Nicaraguan viewer decide whether they should trust CNN journalists or Mr. Ortega?
Okay, Manuel, I know you have been wanting to say something. Please jump in.
I mean, I think I'm not going to argue with the gentleman who thinks that if it's not Russian-inspired, it's wrong. All I can tell you is that there is definitely a response from the international community. Nicaragua is isolated from the world. And I think the European Union response is going to be measured. They're trying to be careful on what type of response they give with regards to the political situation in Nicaragua. For example, Nicaragua has already broken away from the Trade Association Agreement. The Section 3 of the agreement is about governance and democracy. It had already violated that. And I think even though only 6% of Nicaragua's trade is with the European Union, it will be something that will be reviewed. Apart from that, what the European Union has in mind is the Nicaraguan citizens and how to protect them, how to provide a solution to the conflict rather than a confrontation with Ortega. It doesn't pay anyone to the better to deal with Ortega in an aggressive way. Ortega has been provoking the rest of the world to have to find basically an excuse to use the military in the streets, but the world is not going to respond to that.
Okay, Ben, if things continue to move the way they are right now, if Nicaragua continues to sever diplomatic ties with the major countries across the world, are you not concerned that Nicaragua could become an isolated country like North Korea?
No, this is ridiculous hyperbole. The narrative that Nicaragua is isolated ignores the vast majority of the global population. The US and Canada and the European Union do not represent the so-called international community, although the West frequently uses that term to refer to themselves. The reality is that Nicaragua has a lot of allies in Asia, in Africa, and other parts of Latin America. For instance, at his inauguration this January, President Ortega had representatives from China, the most populous country on earth, India, the second most populous country on earth, as well as Russia, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Turkey, many countries in Latin America. We're talking about the vast majority of the global population in the global South. So yes, Nicaragua has very negative relations or no formal relations with the West, with the global North, the countries that have colonized Latin America. But the reality is the world is changing. Nicaragua is on the verge of signing a free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China, and it's increasing its trade with other countries in the global South. This is part of an overall trend around the world away from Western hegemony. So Nicaragua is not unique in that sense. And saying it's diplomatically isolated ignores the majority of the global population. It's not isolated. It's simply the West that has chosen a very aggressive path. And a lot of countries in the global South are refusing to continue with this kind of these neo-colonial policies.
Okay, Peter, so from what I understand, Ben just said Nicaragua can afford to lose the West.
Well, I hope then I hope that they will be smart enough in that case, if they, for example, engage with China, that they do not end up in some kind of a Chinese debt trap. You know, China has been engaging in this, you know, issuing loans to countries that they are then not able to pay back, and then you know, try to grab some of these assets. I mean, I think if you look at the future of the world, yes, it's true that the West has been weakened economically, at least in proportion. This is also thanks to the fact that as a result of free trade, you know, formerly third world countries have become richer, which is in itself a good thing. But yeah, I think we see this dangerous talk of decoupling, and you know, even we'll maybe see that in the internet. You know, countries trying to put up internet walls and to fence off the internet to try to prevent that people can access the internet. But then on the other hand, we have initiatives like the one of Elon Musk that is also helping Iran, that is helping the opposition in Iran, helping Ukraine, sort of to try to block, to go through to these blockades, to this new protectionism, as I would call it. Now, look, what I think is that we have a problem, which is authoritarian regimes. It does not necessarily follow that sanctions and you know, aggressive blockades are the right way to deal with that. I'm afraid in the past we've seen that's not the right policy, but we could try to, you know, support human rights groups. I mean, if the opposition is being mistreated, it's very important, you know, to call that out. Ideally, of course, private human rights groups should do that, but also governments. At the end of the day, there's not so much in the West we can do about this authoritarian tendencies that we see. But that's something.
Okay, now, Manuel, what do you think would be a permanent solution here? What do you think could stop this seemingly exacerbating crisis between Nicaragua and the West from getting worse?
Well, I think, look, the problem is not Nicaragua, the West. The problem is a dictatorship that doesn't allow the citizens to live the full extent of a democracy. And the solution is to have a mediated dialogue. Of course, at this point, Nicaragua, it's a country that is being Talibanized.
All right, Manuel, I'll have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Ben, Manuel, Pieter, thanks very much for talking to us here on The Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.